I don't like the Demon's Souls remake. I think that it's inferior to the original in every way other than graphics. I think the atmosphere is worse. I think the art direction is much diminished. I think many of the changes to the music and to the enemy design misunderstand their purpose in the original. And as a result, the remake fails to capture many of the things that made Demon's Souls good in the first place. I'm not alone in this assessment. There are many fans of the original who also think that the remake for Demon's Souls left much to be desired. So my hope for this video is that people that never played Demon's Souls and have only engaged with the remake are able to understand where me and people like me are coming from in our complaints and criticisms. So in the video I'll be listing what I think the problems are, showing clear examples of these problems, and finally explain why I think they're so egregious. So let's just jump into it. Demon's Souls had a great artistic vision. It was special. Nothing else at the time looked or felt like Demon's Souls. And even though later FromSoft games borrowed heavily from it, those games each had their own unique identity. There still isn't any game that looks or feels like Demon's Souls. In creating something like the Demon's Souls remake, Bluepoint was always going to have to make changes. It is impossible to update the graphics of a 10-year-old game without also making artistic decisions. When you increase the amount of detail in a polygon or a texture, you have to decide how to fill in the detail. You have to figure out what was the original intent of those objects and try to recreate it with the new tools you have available to you. Interpretation is a necessary part of remaking a game like this. So the question is, how did Bluepoint interpret Demon's Souls? Were they faithful to the spirit of the original? And I would argue that the answer to that question is no. Let me read you a quote from Gavin Moore, the director for the Demon's Souls remake. He was asked if the remake was staying true to the original vision. This is his reply. Quote, "When we're doing a remake, we identify what the core is of the game, what is the most important to that game. And for us, in Demon's Souls, that has to be the gameplay and the logic and the AI. So we pare everything away, leaving that core there that you don't want to touch. That's the heart and soul of the game. And then we start building up everything around that game. All new models, all new character designs, taking everything back to the drawing board and building it back up." End quote. Now I think at first glance, this sounds perfectly reasonable. And in fact, it might be the right way to do a remake if they weren't remaking a Souls game specifically. Souls games are more than just their mechanics. The art, the enemy design, and the atmosphere of Demon's Souls are not things that exist outside its core. They're not something you can just strip away and replace with something else. Let me explain what I mean. In Elden Ring you have Stormveil Castle. Stormveil is a reflection of the theme of Godric the Golden, its boss. The castle itself is a pragmatic, defensible fortress, or at least it was at one point. The castle now bears a golden filigree, which was added to the pre-existing, more practical fortress. Despite this, much of the castle lays in ruins, and a mysterious curse eats away at it from below. This perfectly reflects the decadence and degradation of Godric's golden lineage. The golden lineage is the line of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. Godfrey himself was a warrior, known as the Lord of the Battlefield. His strength warranted his crown. Godric, on the other hand, earned his crown through birthright. Godric lays claim to a legacy he had no part in. He doesn't have the strength to warrant his crown. And so, he surrounds himself with the symbols of a golden past, the double-headed axe, the golden lion, and the filigree with which he gilded his castle. All of these things together, they build an atmosphere, and they tell a story. In fact, these are the main ways in which Souls games build their atmosphere and tell their stories. The reason that people are so drawn into thinking about the subtle storytelling of these games is because FromSoft takes great care in the details. Every item placement, every symbol has meaning and intention behind it. By reducing the soul of Demon's Souls to just gameplay, Bluepoint either didn't recognize that intention, or they simply didn't care about it. For an example, let's compare Latria Palace between Demon's Souls and the remake. In Demon's Souls, Latria Palace is a simple medieval castle. It is a pragmatic Norman fortress. There's no bells or whistles attached, it's a defensive structure. In the remake, the architectural style has been thrown several hundred years into the future. It's adorned with Gothic spires and more elaborate decorations, like the 50-foot-long blue banners that decorate the castle gate. This has a different meaning to the original design. It's no longer just a castle built to defend its inhabitants during wartime. It now paints a picture of a more developed and opulent culture, concerned with appearance. This is especially egregious in the mausoleum which houses Old King Doran and Demonbrand, which has now been turned into a fully fledged Gothic-style cathedral. Turning this mausoleum into an ornate church says something different about the inhabitants of Boletaria, and what they thought about their old king and his legend. The worst offense in Boletarian Palace is the incredible amount of plant overgrowth added in the remake. Prince Ostrava has recently returned to Boletaria to see his father, King Alat, after being gone from the land for some time. Ostrava is still a young man, and he is completely surprised by the degenerate state of Boletaria. He indicates that the Boletaria he knew was a great kingdom at its peak, and this means that the entire story of Demon Souls, the story of Alant bringing the soul arts to Boletaria, and the kingdom's descent into corruption, must have happened incredibly recently, something in the order of 5 to 10 years. The plant overgrowth added in the remake is something that could only happen after decades or even centuries of disrepair. This makes no sense, and the only conclusion is that either Bluepoint didn't understand the timeline, or they didn't care and they just wanted this lush, nice-looking plant overgrowth everywhere. In their defense, it does actually look pretty nice. Now you might say that I'm being needlessly nitpicky, and just finding things to criticize about the remake. But don't worry, there's a lot worse examples upcoming. More importantly, the problem is, in Souls games this kind of stuff matters. As I showed with the Stormveil example, these games are laden with meaning. It's hard to tell what might be important. There's a popular Souls YouTuber called Hawkshaw that makes lore videos. He made a video on Elden Ring that's 2 hours long, talking about the color theory in Elden Ring. In it, he argues that the different colors in Elden Ring have important associations, that they have important meanings. And like I mentioned, this is a 2-hour-long video in which he goes into great detail. Now, it doesn't actually matter whether Hawkshaw's theory is correct or not. That's not the point. The point is that in order for him to have come up with his theory, he needs the colors to be what they are in the game. If Elden Ring gets a remake, and the developer that's making the remake haphazardly decides that something that's one color should be a different color, then this potentially changes the whole context of Hawkshaw's theory. Maybe he doesn't think of the theory at all. The details in this game are important. They're important to the timeline. They're important to the themes. They're important to the way that we extrapolate the lore. Now you might think that Bluepoint should get some leeway in their interpretation of the narrative. The Souls community spends years examining details and theorizing about different aspects of these stories, so to some degree you can't blame Bluepoint for missing how important certain details might be as they're redesigning the game. But the thing is, you wouldn't need to deeply understand the story or the lore or care about any of that if you approached this project with humility and tried to stick closely to the original designs. But Bluepoint didn't do that. In several places, they deliberately chose to depart from the original designs and introduce their own ideas without carefully considering whether those changes made sense. Take for example the mausoleum of Old King Doran. The statue inside the mausoleum has been changed from a crazy anime warrior with flowing hair to a generic knight guy. This was not interpretation. This was a decision. And it's an offensive decision, really. It's an arrogant decision. This is a clear example of Bluepoint thinking that they know better than Miyazaki. There's no way to look at this change in statue and say this is just a different interpretation of the same thing. No, this is a situation in which Bluepoint looked at the original design and decided they didn't like it. Decided that they knew better than From Software. They didn't like the anime warrior guy. Maybe they thought that the flowing anime hair didn't really fit the atmosphere. And so they replaced the original statue with something that suited their sensibilities more. Another example is the existence of the classic mode filter. I think this filter is proof that, at some level, Bluepoint knew what they were doing. They knew that they were departing from the original intent of the game's aesthetic. In the remake, various visual filters can be applied during photo mode or gameplay, which change the color palette and the lighting of the game. One of these filters is called Classic Mode, which reduces the oversaturated colors of the remake's default visual style and makes it look more like the lighting and the color of the original game. The fact that they included this Classic Mode filter means that they knew their default version in the remake isn't like the original game. It isn't just an interpretation of the original game's aesthetic. It's something which is consciously different, and this implies a kind of arrogance. It implies that they think their version is better than the original. Let me read you another quote from Gavin Moore about the remake. Quote, "Doing a remake, the thing for us is, you have to remember that way you played the game 11 years ago is not the way you imagine the game. You imagine it completely different. So when you think back to how you beat the Tower Knight, for instance, how epic that battle was, how amazing the music was. But if you went back to it today, yeah, it's still an incredible game, but it's probably not what your imagination remembers. And that's what we had to do. We had to basically create the game in a way that players of the original PlayStation 3 version imagined it to be." End quote. I find this quote extremely condescending. Gavin is saying that people who love the original Demon's Souls are looking at the past with rose-tinted glasses, that fans of the original game imagine it to be better than it was. Essentially, that we're wrong for liking it as much as we do. And here's the problem. I don't have to imagine Tower Knight. I can turn on my PlayStation 3 and go fight him right now. And you know what? I think it's a pretty epic battle. I think that it's true to the image in my memories. I think the music is pretty amazing. What Gavin's quote reveals is that when he went back and played Demon's Souls, he didn't like it. He wasn't a fan, and he wanted to improve it. Well, let's take a look at how it was improved. There are two significant changes in the remake for the Tower Knight battle: the music and the design of the Fat Official. In the original game, the Fat Officials oversee the people of Boletaria and Stonefang. Their rich gold and black clothing and obese figure indicates their high position. They're the right-hand men of Alant. They are responsible for the corruption of Boletaria. Their most distinctive feature is the enormous grin they wear on their face. It isn't clear whether this is actually a face or a mask which has been turned into a face, but the expression is one of pure evil. It's the expression of someone who delights in the suffering of others, a disturbed, sadistic mind. Every time they see you, they produce a distinctive laugh, which sounds like they can't hold back their joy at the prospect of causing you harm. The point of the Tower Knight cutscene is to make you really hate this guy. The whole battle is a setup. You walk in and you see this enormous knight that seems ridiculous to even consider fighting in single combat. And then you see the Fat Official behind him, signal a bunch of archers on the walls. And then he starts laughing at you. He's laughing at your misfortune. He's laughing at how he's tricked you with this ambush, and now you're gonna die. In the next level, you can see his sadistic sense of humor once again, when he laughs at his own soldier getting impaled by the closing gate. Finally, you reach the boss room and he's there. It feels like you're finally gonna get your revenge on this guy. Your catharsis is right there. And then suddenly the Penetrator impales him, robbing you of your revenge and subverting your expectations. The design of the Fat Official, his creepy, inhuman grinning face, and his opulent figure and clothing, is an important part of communicating how the game wants you to feel about this guy. Changing his design also changes the way you feel about him. In the remake, the Fat Officials just look gross. They have a normal human face rather than a shiny black mask, which instead of grinning with sadistic pleasure, looks angry or pained. They're also covered with boils on their faces and their stomachs, and their gut sticks out, giving them a slovenly appearance. This redesign for the Fat Official changes everything. It changes the whole context of their character. The reason the Fat Officials were fat wasn't because they were disgusting slobs. It was because they were exploiting Boletaria and its people, and they were getting rich and fat off the spoils. It wasn't a representation of slovenliness, it was a representation of greed and the desire for power. But more than that, the boils and the pained human expression of the new design make the Fat Officials look more like a victim rather than a perpetrator. The new design paints them as men who have been afflicted by the horrible conditions of Boletaria, rather than the men who caused the horrible conditions of Boletaria. This changes the tone of the Fat Officials, and the emotional effect of the cutscene that introduces the Tower Knight. Several other redesigns show the same tendency towards making things look disgusting. The design of the original Vanguard was eccentric, and even somewhat comical in appearance. In the remake, he's more of a generic demon. In addition, he has this human-colored flesh, and his skin is decaying and afflicted with boils, similar to the fat officials. In the original, he looked like a dumb brute. In the remake, he looks like a disgusting monster. The Adjudicator's redesign is even more stark. If there's one thing anyone remembers from the original Adjudicator boss fight, it's sticking your face up close to his rubbery golden yellow body. He looks like a balloon or a sandbag, and despite having arms and legs, he looks distinctly inhuman. So why would you make his skin look realistic and add giant floppy breasts? What exactly is gained from this change? He's not even yellow anymore, he's just another disgusting fleshy slob, like the fat officials and the Vanguard. These changes don't just affect the individual bosses, they affect the tone of the game. In the Design Works interview for Dark Souls 1, Miyazaki was asked if there was anything he tried to avoid in his design. He replied, "You may not believe me, but I always tried to maintain a certain level of refinement and elegance in all designs. I often told the artists that muddy or messy is definitely not good. I think this carries through the entire game. If you asked me to describe what this elegance is, well, I think you would have to look at the designs and judge for yourselves, but it really is one of the most important factors in everything I oversee." The Fat Official, Vanguard, and Adjudicator redesigns lack the quality that Miyazaki is talking about. They're just gross. On a visceral level, they're gross for the sake of being gross, which makes them less interesting, but it also makes the game as a whole less beautiful. Demon Souls is in some ways the most overtly disturbing world that Miyazaki has produced, but its unique identity comes from how it portrays the dark and disturbing world in a way that still makes it elegant. The remake doesn't do that. There's no subtlety or nuance in the remake's designs. You could describe the new designs for Fat Official, Vanguard, and Adjudicator as intimidating, realistic, or impressive, but you couldn't describe them as elegant. They don't make you feel anything besides disgust. And the original Demon Souls wanted you to feel something. It didn't want you to just marvel at the graphics. It wanted you to form an emotional connection with the world and its themes. Which is a good segue into talking about Latria. Because Latria suffered the worst changes in the whole game. In Demon Souls, Latria is a nightmare. It is a place about cruelty and torture and the corruption of the human spirit. The first stage is designed as a maze to make you feel lost and on edge. The atmosphere is disquieting, which ties into the theme of the area. A big part of that atmosphere comes from the sound design. When you first load into the area, you'll hear insects buzzing, which immediately makes you think of death and decay. It's the most immediately memorable part of the sound design for Latria. As you start exploring the first stage of Latria, the sound of buzzing insects is punctuated by the groans of prisoners and the bells of the intimidating mind flayers, reinforcing the feeling of terror and anxiety. Besides those sound effects, it's very quiet, almost too quiet, which makes the sound of Lord Rydell more alarming as soon as you start walking the corridors, which is startlingly loud because he's right below you. All of these simple but effective sounds are either gone or mixed much lower in the remake. The insects are just gone completely. Rydell's screams are extremely quiet. Instead, the most prominent sound in Latria is the mistress singing Return to Slumber. This is the most foolish decision in the entire remake. Absolutely incomprehensible. Latria is oppressive. It's supposed to be stressful. Latria is characterized by the buzzing of insects, by the sound of the warden's bells, punctuated by the screams of its prisoners. More than any other section in the game, the atmosphere in Latria is paramount. And in this most sacred of places, did Bluepoint choose to introduce soothing music. Gone is the buzzing of the insects. The sound of the Illithid's bells, and the sound of the prisoner asking for help is greatly reduced. Instead, we get a lullaby that makes exploring this hellscape downright pleasant. To make matters worse, the song that the noblewoman sings is Return to Slumber. Return to Slumber is one of the songs that plays at the ending, when you choose to lull the old one back to sleep. The implication with the song is that it's the Maiden in Black singing. It's the lullaby she uses to put him to sleep. In addition to the fact that it makes no sense for the mistress to sing the Maiden in Black's lullaby to the old one here, Return to Slumber is also one of the only tracks in the game that sounds pleasant and relaxing, which should be a reward for finishing the game, not an accompaniment for an area about human torture. If it weren't for the Iron Maidens, the remake's version of the ironically titled Prison of Hope would feel actually hopeful and downright cozy. And on top of that, it doesn't even just ruin the atmosphere, it has a gameplay effect. In the original, the mistress also sang, but she only sang 2 notes over and over again. And you couldn't hear them at the start of the level. You could only hear them when you get into close proximity with her. The 2 notes were eerie and disturbing, which is not the same feeling produced by the comforting lullaby that she sings in the remake. Having heard only bells and insects up until this point, you as the player will try and investigate where that sound is coming from, letting you happen upon the once royal mistress. In the remake, the song can be heard as soon as you load into the level, so you have no way of knowing that it's not just normal to have this sound. You could just think it's background music for all you know. So apart from changing the atmosphere, the remake also negatively affects the gameplay, because it reduces the likelihood that players will happen upon the mistress. Finally, the boss at the end of Latria's first stage is the Fool's Idol, and once again Bluepoint completely misses the point. When the old monk returned to Latria, garbed in a strange yellow robe, with demons in tow, he supplanted his Ivory Queen and set up the Fool's Idol in her place, to trick the prisoners into a false hope which he could draw upon as a source of demonic power. For this story to make sense, the Fool's Idol has to look like something that would inspire hope, something which people could believe was actually the Ivory Queen. In Demon's Souls, she looks pale and regal, a precursor to Queen Renala's design in Elden Ring. The church is bathed in golden light, which reinforces the idea that on the surface, at least, this place and the false queen look sacred. In the remake, you have to believe that either the inhabitants of Latria never saw the Fool's Idol, or that they're incredibly dumb, because it's pretty obvious from the way she looks that she isn't good news. The place is now bathed in a creepy green light, and the Fool's Idol herself looks like an angry witch. Something more like Kali the Destroyer from Hindu mythology, rather than the benevolent savior she's supposed to look like. In fact, I'm convinced that Kali is the inspiration for the Fool's Idol. Bluepoint saw that she has 4 arms, and she's like, well, Kali right there, let's use that as our model for the Fool's Idol. Which is infuriating. Who told them that they can get other inspirations? Who told them that they can fundamentally change other people's work in the delusion that what they're doing is better? I think that fundamentally, the problem is this. I believe that a remake should be true to the spirit of the original, that it should be approached with humility, that the people charged with producing a remake should, as much as possible, try to keep the original designs, try to understand and preserve the atmosphere that the original engendered, and that when you come up against something that you don't like or you don't understand, you leave it the fuck alone, because it's not your business. You don't decide that you don't like the anime-haired warrior and change it. You don't decide that because a boss has 4 arms, you model it after Kali. And you don't add music to a level in a game that in its time was famous for not having any background music. And it seems to me, based on the examples that I've given, that Bluepoint doesn't agree with my perspective. What I wanted from this remake was just Demon's Souls with a shinier coat of paint. That would have been ideal. But instead, Bluepoint knowingly made comprehensive changes to the art direction, the music, and the overall aesthetic, many of which contradict the intention of the original game and dilute its unique identity. Now at this point you might be thinking, what does it really matter if the remake is different? The original game still exists. You can go and play the original if you don't like the remake. It's not hurting anybody. Can't you just let people enjoy things? And to that I say 3 things. First of all, it is hurting somebody, it's hurting me. Second of all, no, I can't let people enjoy things, because that would prevent me from enjoying the thing I like the most, which is critical analysis and being a hater. Finally, and most importantly, it's just wrong. The existence of the remake does in fact damage the original. The Demon's Souls remake only exists because of the love that the fans had for the original game, and the existence of the remake reduces greatly the probability that the original will ever get ported to new systems, and much less get a remaster. Bluepoint's Remake doesn't preserve Demon Souls. It parasitizes Demon Souls and preserves itself. It feeds off the quality of Demon Souls, and harms the chances we'll ever get the original to see the light of day. Finally, I'd like to make one more point. Even if you disagree with me, and think that the remake is superior to the original, I hope that you at least understand where I'm coming from. I think that video games are art. The remake was an opportunity to have people experience a game that they missed out on. It was an opportunity for people to experience Miyazaki's seminal work. Demon Souls is the first Souls game, the progenitor of Dark Souls, and as a result, the origin of all Souls-likes. It is unique even among other Souls games, and that uniqueness is what I was hoping people would experience with the coming of this remake. And it is my belief that the remake did not preserve that uniqueness, and thus can't deliver it to others. So in my view, it doesn't really matter if the remake is better or not. It's not Demon Souls. It's a different piece of art. And for something like a Souls game, different is not what a remake should be. And that's the end of this video. Please unsubscribe and unclick the bell notification. I would appreciate if in the comment section, people accuse others of nostalgia, and if other people could in response accuse the commenter of recency bias, that would be great. Any comments questioning each other's sense of taste would also be appreciated. Remember that the comment should be scathing, but not so scathing that their YouTube censors remove it. Just adversarial enough that it incites other people to respond to you. If this video has not motivated you to do any of that, then I am sure I'll get to you in a future video. Until then, thank you very much for watching.